Stop scrolling. Because while you were watching charts and arguing about price targets, something happened in Europe that nobody announced. No press release, no headline, no warning. Just a quiet rule change that now sits between you and the metal. If you walk into certain dealers across Germany, Austria, France, and beyond, and you try to buy a standard silver bar, something new happens. They ask for your ID, they ask for your address, they ask for documentation. And if you hesitate, if you ask why, the answer is always the same. New regulations, required now, non-negotiable. That's it, no debate. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. This didn't roll out with a vote. It didn't get discussed in parliament sessions that you watched. It just appeared. One week the metal moved freely. The next week, the gates closed. So the question we're going to answer today is simple. Why now? Why Europe? And who benefits when the public loses access to large-scale physical silver without being tracked, logged, and registered? Before we go any further, I need to ask you something small but powerful. My analytics show that a huge percentage of you watch these videos all the way through, but many of you still haven't subscribed. If you value this kind of breakdown, hit subscribe right now and drop a quick comment, even just thanks, so the algorithm knows you want original work, not recycled copycat uploads. All right, let's start with what actually happened, because the details matter and the details are being buried. In the span of just a few weeks, dealers across multiple European countries began enforcing new identification requirements for silver purchases. Not gold, not platinum, silver, and not just any silver. The rules target bars and bulk products above certain thresholds. In some places, it's anything over 2,000 euros. In others, it's any transaction involving kilo bars or larger cast products. The exact threshold varies by country, but the pattern is the same. If you want serious size, you enter the system. Now you might be thinking, okay, but that's just standard anti-money laundering stuff, right? Governments do that all the time. And yes, AML rules exist everywhere. But here's the part that doesn't add up. These rules appeared suddenly. They were implemented without the usual public consultation period. And they were coordinated across borders in a way that suggests top-down pressure, not organic local policy evolution. When multiple countries roll out similar restrictions at nearly the same time, that's not coincidence, that's orchestration. So let's ask the uncomfortable question. What kind of pressure would cause European regulators to suddenly tighten access to physical silver? Because if the goal was truly just compliance, why not apply the same rules to all precious metals equally? Why single out silver? And why set the threshold low enough to catch normal retail accumulation, not just suspicious bulk transactions? Here's what I think is happening. And I'm going to say this carefully because it's easy to sound conspiratorial when you're simply describing coordination. I think someone somewhere in the policy chain has recognized that physical silver is becoming a pressure point, not because of investors, because of industry, because of supply chains, because of the quiet reality that silver is consumed, not just held. And when something is consumed at scale and supply is constrained, the last thing you want is a public run on available inventory. Now, think about the timing. This didn't happen during the sleepy years when silver was trading in the teens or low 20s. This happened after silver broke out, after it touched the mid-30s, pulled back, then charged into the 80s and 90s. After delivery numbers on major exchanges hit record levels. After vault inventories in key hubs began tightening, after industrial buyers started quietly securing long-term contracts. In other words, this happened when the metal started mattering again. And here's the part that should make every serious investor pause. When a government restricts access to something, it's often because that thing is becoming strategically important. They don't restrict junk. They don't track worthless assets. They track and restrict the things that matter, the things that could become bottlenecks, the things that could destabilize supply chains if demand surges uncontrollably. So if European regulators are now requiring ID for silver purchases above modest thresholds, what does that tell you about their internal assessments? What does it tell you about the conversations happening behind closed doors? Because I promise you, those conversations are not about protecting you from yourself. They're about managing a resource that the system needs to function. Now let's talk about what this means in practice, because the mechanics reveal the intent. When you're forced to provide ID, your purchase is logged, it's entered into a database, it's trackable, and in future scenarios where governments need to implement capital controls, wealth taxes, or emergency requisitions, that database becomes a roadmap. They know who has what. They know where it is. They know how much you paid. And if the crisis gets deep enough, they know where to look. I'm not saying that's guaranteed to happen. I'm saying the infrastructure for it is being built right now. And when infrastructure gets built quietly, it's usually because someone expects to use it. Now here's where the story gets darker. Because the rule isn't just about logging purchases. In some cases, it's effectively a soft ban on cash transactions above a certain size. If you can't pay cash anonymously, you have to use traceable payment methods, bank transfers, credit cards, digital rails, all of which create permanent records, and all of which can be monitored, frozen, or reversed if policy changes. So what looked like a simple compliance update is actually a rewiring of how metal moves. It's a shift from private exchange to monitored exchange. And monitored exchange is not free exchange, it's controlled exchange. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you're someone who has been quietly stacking silver for years. Small purchases, nothing flashy, just building a position over time. Under the old system, you could walk into a shop, pay cash, take the metal, and leave. No trail, no record, no one's business but yours. Under the new system, every meaningful purchase is filed, your name is attached, your accumulation is visible, and if policy shifts tomorrow and someone decides private ownership above a certain level needs to be reported or taxed or limited, they already have the list. This is not paranoia, this is pattern recognition. Because history is full of moments where governments changed the rules on metals ownership when financial stress increased. And the setup today, massive debt, currency concerns, supply chain fragility, looks a lot like the setup that historically triggered those kinds of moves. Now, I want to zoom out for a second and talk about why Europe specifically. Because Europe has always had a more centralized regulatory approach than the US. It's easier to coordinate policy across the EU framework. It's easier to implement directives that ripple through member states. And it's also a region that has been dealing with energy crises, inflation concerns, and political instability more visibly than other parts of the developed world. When a region is under stress, it tightens control over strategic resources. And silver, despite being labeled a precious metal, is actually more of a strategic industrial input. It's used in solar panels, electronics, EV components, medical devices, and defense systems. So if European planners believe supply could tighten further, they have an incentive to track who is accumulating it and in what quantities. That's the surface logic. But there's a deeper logic too. When you make it harder for the public to buy something, you reduce competition for institutional buyers. If governments or connected entities need to secure silver for industrial or strategic purposes, the last thing they want is millions of retail buyers driving up premiums and draining available supply. So you create friction, you add bureaucracy, you make it annoying enough that casual buyers give up. And the serious buyers, the ones with resources and patience, they navigate the new system and keep accumulating. This is how access gets tiered without anyone admitting it's being tiered. Now, let's talk about the psychological impact, because this is where the rule change does its real damage. When people know their purchases are being tracked, behavior changes. Some people buy less, some people buy differently, some people stop entirely. That's the chilling effect. And a chilling effect on demand is exactly what you'd want if you were trying to manage a tight market without admitting the market is tight. But here's the twist. The chilling effect works on weak conviction buyers. It doesn't work on strong conviction buyers. If someone truly believes silver is entering a structural shortage, a little paperwork doesn't stop them. It annoys them, but it doesn't stop them. So what this rule does is filter the crowd. It separates the tourists from the committed. And in a way that makes the committed buyers even more dangerous to the system, because they're the ones who won't sell easily when volatility hits. Now, I need to plant a cliffhanger here because the next part is where things get truly uncomfortable. This rule didn't appear in isolation. It appeared alongside other signals that the European financial system is under strain. Bond yields rising, energy costs spiking, political fragmentation increasing, currency stability questioned. When you see restrictions on asset access during a period of financial stress, it's usually because planners are preparing for scenarios they don't want to discuss publicly. So what scenarios could those be? Let's think it through. Scenario 1, a currency crisis where capital flight becomes a concern. If people start converting euros into hard assets at scale, that weakens the currency and destabilizes the bond market, so you add friction to slow the flow. Scenario 2, a supply crisis where industrial silver becomes genuinely scarce. If factories can't source metal, governments may need to ration or redirect supply. And to do that, they need visibility into who has what. Scenario 3, a wealth control scenario where governments facing budget pressure implement emergency taxes or confiscation measures. And again, you need a database to make that enforceable. I'm not predicting which scenario plays out. I'm observing that all three scenarios benefit from the same infrastructure, a registry of private silver holders. And that registry is being built right now under the cover of compliance. Now, here's where I want you to pay very close attention, because this is where the story connects to the bigger global picture. Europe is not the only region where metals access is being quietly managed. There have been reports of increased scrutiny in other jurisdictions as well. Export restrictions, import licensing, refining bottlenecks being tightened through regulatory pressure. Each individual move sounds boring, but when you map them together, the pattern is clear. Physical metal is being funneled through narrower and narrower channels. And that brings us to the core question. If silver is so abundant, if supply is so easy, if there's no real concern about availability, then why would anyone bother restricting access? Why create bureaucracy around something that's supposedly plentiful? The answer is simple. They don't. You don't build walls around things that don't matter. You build walls around things you're worried about losing control of. Now, let me address something that always comes up in the comments. People say, but John A.G., if they're tracking purchases, doesn't that just mean they're cracking down on crime? And my answer is always the same. If the goal is catching criminals, why set the threshold so low? Because serious money laundering doesn't happen in kilo bars bought at retail shops. It happens through offshore structures, shell companies, and complex financial instruments. So when a rule targets normal retail buyers, instead of the actual sophisticated bad actors, you have to question whether the stated purpose is the real purpose. This is not cynicism. This is observation. Governments frequently use legitimate-sounding justifications to implement controls that serve other goals. And in a financial system that is increasingly fragile, maintaining visibility and control over hard asset flows is a strategic priority. Now, let's talk about what this does to the market itself, because rules like this don't just affect buyers. They affect sellers too. If selling silver now requires the same documentation as buying it, recycling supply can slow down. People who might have sold old bars or liquidated positions during a price spike may hesitate if it means entering a government database. So the metal stays in private hands longer. Less recycling means tighter available supply, and tighter supply means higher premiums. See how the rule feeds the problem it claims to solve? If the goal was truly market stability, you'd want more liquidity, more recycling, more flow. But if the goal is control, you want visibility first and liquidity second. And that's exactly what these rules prioritize. Now, I'm going to give you a practical example that shows how this plays out in real time. Let's say you're a European investor who accumulated silver over the past few years. You bought privately, you paid cash, you stored it yourself. No one knows you have it except you. Now imagine silver surges to a level where you want to take profit. Under the old system, you could walk into a dealer, sell, take cash, and disappear. Clean exit. Under the new system, you sell, provide ID, get logged, and now your holdings are visible. If a wealth tax or emergency measure gets implemented later, you're on the list. So what do? Many people hold longer than they planned. They avoid the sale, they wait. And while they wait, the supply available to new buyers stays constrained. This is how a tracking system can inadvertently create the exact scarcity it was supposedly designed to prevent. Now, there's another dimension to this that most people completely miss. When access to physical silver gets restricted in one region, it doesn't make the metal less valuable globally. It makes that region less competitive. If European buyers face more friction than buyers in other parts of the world, silver flows elsewhere. It flows to regions with fewer restrictions. And those regions gain the strategic advantage. This is why China has been so aggressive in building refining capacity, securing mining partnerships, and creating domestic vaulting infrastructure. They understand that in a world where physical assets matter, control over the supply chain is power. And Europe, by making it harder for its own citizens to accumulate freely, is essentially handing that power to regions with fewer restrictions. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but John A.G., can't people just buy from online dealers or international sources? Yes, for now. But here's the trap. Once a regulatory framework is established domestically, it's very easy to extend it. Today, it's in-person purchases. Tomorrow, it's shipments. Next month, it's imports. And before you know it, every pathway has the same requirement. Provide ID or don't transact. This is how control expands, not all at once, incrementally. And each increment feels small enough that people accept it. Until one day, they realize the door is closed and they never saw it happening. Now, let's connect this to the broader silver story, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. At the same time, these rules are appearing. We're seeing record delivery activity on major exchanges. We're seeing persistent premiums in Asia. We're seeing wholesalers marking no bid, even while demand is screaming. We're seeing supply chains showing stress signals that used to only appear during genuine shortages. So when you layer a new access restriction on top of an already tight market, what do you get? You get a market where the people who move first have a massive advantage over the people who hesitate. And you get a market where the premium for immediate access becomes its own signal. Let me explain that more clearly. In a normal market, if spot silver is trading at $90, you should be able to walk into a dealer and buy close to that price, maybe a few dollars premium. But in a restricted market, the premium can blow out because supply to the public is artificially constrained. The dealer knows they can't easily restock. They know the wholesaler is stressed. They know new rules make sourcing harder. So they widen the spread, they raise the premium, and the real price you pay becomes $105, $110, maybe more. And here's the brutal part. That premium is not speculation, it's friction. It's the cost of navigating a system that's been deliberately made harder to navigate. Now, I want to talk about something that almost never gets discussed. The rule change didn't just affect new buyers. It affected the entire secondary market. Because if someone bought silver years ago without documentation and now wants to sell, they may face pressure to provide retroactive information. Where did you get this? When did you buy it? Can you prove the source? In a truly free market, those questions shouldn't matter. Metal is metal. But in a controlled market, provenance becomes a weapon. And if you can't prove clean acquisition, your ability to sell gets questioned. This is how rules designed to catch criminals end up trapping normal people. Now, I'm going to shift gears for a moment because there's a human element here that matters. Privacy is not about hiding crime. Privacy is about dignity. It's about the right to make decisions without surveillance. It's about not having to justify every choice to a faceless bureaucracy. And when privacy is eroded, it's usually the most vulnerable who suffer first. The people without lawyers, the people without connections, the people who trusted the system and didn't see the trap. So when I talk about silver access being restricted, I'm not just talking about investment strategy, I'm talking about freedom. And freedom is always taken gradually, never all at once. Now, let's talk about the enforcement mechanism because this is where the rule becomes real. Dealers don't have a choice. If they sell to you without collecting the required information, they face penalties, fines, license suspension, legal action. So even sympathetic dealers, the ones who understand why this is wrong, are forced to comply. They become agents of enforcement, not by choice, but by survival. And here's the part that should terrify you. Once the infrastructure is in place, the threshold can be lowered. Now, I want to address the people who say, I have nothing to hide, so why should I care? Here's why. Because the definition of suspicious can change. Because the list of restricted activities can expand. Because what is legal today can become illegal tomorrow. And if you're already in the system, already logged, already tracked, you have no anonymity when the rules shift. This is why privacy advocates have been screaming about this kind of creep for decades. Not because they're criminals, because they understand that once you give up privacy, you don't get it back. Now, let's connect this to the vault story because the two are linked. At the same time, European buyers are being required to register. Physical silver is draining from key storage hubs. COMEX registered inventory has been falling. London Vault reports show tightness. And Asian premiums remain elevated, signaling strong demand in regions with fewer restrictions. So what's happening is a geographic arbitrage of freedom. Metal is flowing toward the places where it can move freely and away from the places where it's being monitored and controlled. And that flow is not random, it's rational. It's capital seeking the path of least resistance. Now, here's a cliffhanger I want you to hold on to. If European supply becomes restricted and Asian demand stays strong, where does the metal come from? Because mines don't care about borders, but supply chains do. And supply chains can be choked by policy just as easily as by geology. Let me ask you a direct question, and I want you to answer in the comments. Do you think these new rules are about protecting the public or controlling the public? And if you think it's control, what do you think they're preparing for? Now, there's another layer to this that involves the wholesale network. We've already talked in previous videos about the sold out no bid phenomenon, where distributors have inventory shortages on the sell side and liquidity problems on the buy side. When you add identification requirements on top of that stress, the entire chain gets slower and more expensive. Dealers have to process paperwork. They have to verify documents. They have to store records. They have to comply with audits. All of that takes time and money. And who pays for that? You do, through higher premiums, through slower service, through reduced access. So the rule doesn't just track you, it taxes you. And the tax is invisible because it's buried in the spread. Now, I want to talk about the parallel with gold because it's revealing. In most European jurisdictions, buying gold coins and small bars still doesn't require the same level of documentation as silver. Why? Because gold is more expensive per unit. Because gold is less industrially critical. Because gold is already tracked through different mechanisms like VAT and import records. But silver? Silver is the wild card. It's cheap enough to accumulate in size. It's industrial enough to matter for critical supply chains. And it's scarce enough that a public run could actually strain physical availability. So if you're a planner worried about system stability, silver is the asset you'd want to monitor first. And that's exactly what's happening. Now let's talk about what comes next, because this is where the retention really kicks in. If these rules stick and expand, we're likely to see a bifurcation in the silver market. On one side, the tracked market. Official dealers, documented transactions, regulated flow. On the other side, the gray market, private sales, peer-to-peer exchanges, cash deals that happen off the books. And here's the danger. Gray markets are less safe. They're more vulnerable to scams. They're harder to navigate for normal people. So by pushing transactions underground, the rule doesn't eliminate risk. It redistributes risk onto the people least equipped to handle it. This is why I keep saying these policies hurt the average person far more than they hurt the wealthy or connected. The wealthy have lawyers. They have structures. They have ways to move capital that don't require walking into a coin shop. But the average person? The average person just gets squeezed. Now, I promised you I'd connect this to the global picture, so here it is. What's happening in Europe is part of a broader trend toward financial control and surveillance. Governments everywhere are trying to close the gaps in their monitoring systems. They're digitizing currency. They're tracking transactions. They're building frameworks that give them visibility into every flow of value. And physical metals are one of the last remaining gaps. Because physical can be held privately. It can be transacted peer-to-peer. It can move without leaving a digital trail. And in a world where every other form of wealth is increasingly monitored, that privacy is valuable. So valuable, in fact, that governments are working to eliminate it. Now, I want to end this section with a question that you need to sit with. If the system is so stable, if currencies are so solid, if debt is so manageable, then why are they working so hard to track and control access to physical metals? Why build infrastructure for monitoring if there's no crisis coming? The answer, of course, is that they see something you're not supposed to see yet. They see the stress, they see the strain, they see the possibility that the public might lose confidence. And when confidence breaks, people run to exits. And if those exits are physical assets, governments want to know who's running and where they're going. This is preparation for control. And it's happening right now. Now, before we move into the next section, I need to mention something practical for those of you who want faster updates and more direct commentary. I've set up a WhatsApp channel where I share daily posts, quick voice notes, and instant alerts when something important hits the tape. The link is in the description. Join it if you want to stay ahead of the curve, because these moments don't wait for upload schedules. All right, now let's talk about what this means for your strategy, because understanding the problem without having a response leaves you stuck. If you're in Europe and you want to continue building a silver position, you now have to make a choice. Comply with the new system and accept that your holdings are logged, or find alternative pathways and accept the increased complexity and risk. Neither option is perfect, and that's by design. Because when both choices have costs, people freeze. They delay, they hope the situation resolves itself, and while they're frozen, the opportunity passes. So here's my framework, and I'm not telling you what to do, I'm telling you what the informed crowd tends to do in situations like this. First, they front-load accumulation. If they believe the window is closing, they buy before it fully closes. They accept the documentation requirement as a cost of access, but they do it now rather than waiting for restrictions to tighten further. Second, they diversify storage. They don't keep everything in one place. They don't rely on a single jurisdiction. They understand that rules can change and access can be frozen, so they spread risk geographically. Third, they build relationships. In restricted environments, trust matters. Knowing a dealer personally, having a track record, being a known customer. All of that can make the difference between getting access and being turned away when supply is tight. And fourth, they stay informed. They watch for new restrictions. They monitor enforcement. They adjust as the landscape shifts. Because in a controlled market, the rules are not static. They evolve. And evolution always favors the people who see it coming. Now, I want to introduce another cliffhanger because the story is about to get even more intense. This rule change in Europe is not the endpoint. It's the beginning. Because once the precedent is set, once the infrastructure exists, it becomes very easy to expand the scope. Today it's silver bars above 2,000 euros. Tomorrow it could be any silver purchase. Next month it could include gold. Next year it could include any asset considered strategic. And once that happens, the concept of private ownership becomes a permission-based privilege, not a fundamental right. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, this doesn't affect me, I'm not in Europe, think again. Because policy innovation spreads. What starts in one region often becomes a template for others. And if European-style restrictions prove effective at managing metal flows and tracking accumulation, other governments will adopt similar frameworks. This is how global coordination happens. Not through treaties, through imitation. Now, let's talk about the dealers themselves, because they're caught in the middle of this. On one hand, they want to serve customers, they want to move metal, they want to build business. On the other hand, they're being forced to act as data collectors for the state. And that creates a moral and practical tension. Some dealers comply reluctantly, some comply enthusiastically, and some push back by finding loopholes or creative interpretations of the rules. But the pressure is real, and the pressure is designed to make non-compliance too risky. This is how systems tighten, not by force, by incentive, by making the cost of resistance higher than the cost of obedience. Now, I need to plant one more disturbing idea before we move into the final act. If these rules are truly about anti-money laundering and public safety, why weren't they implemented years ago when silver was cheaper and less relevant? Why wait until now, when industrial demand is surging, when vault inventories are tightening, when delivery numbers are at record levels? When geopolitical tension is rising, the timing tells you everything. This is not a routine update. This is a response to something. And that something is pressure. Pressure from industrial users who can't secure supply, pressure from strategic planners who see shortages coming, pressure from financial authorities who worry about capital flight into hard assets. And when pressure builds, governments don't announce it. They just act. And the action almost always looks like control. Now, I want to bring this full circle because we started with a simple observation and we've built it into a structure. The observation was Europe quietly implemented ID requirements for silver purchases. The structure is, this is part of a broader trend toward financial surveillance and hard asset control in a system under stress. And the question you have to answer for yourself is, do you believe that trend stops here, or do you believe it accelerates? Because if it accelerates, the window for private accumulation is closing, not next year, not next decade, now. So here's what I'm watching. I'm watching whether other European countries adopt similar rules. I'm watching whether the thresholds get lowered. I'm watching whether enforcement becomes stricter. And I'm watching whether similar restrictions appear in other regions. If 2 or more of those things happen in the next 6 months, it's not speculation anymore. It's a coordinated tightening of access. And coordinated tightening usually means someone is preparing for a scenario where uncontrolled access becomes a systemic risk. Now, before I give you the final takeaway, I need to mention the members-only video. By the time you're watching this, there should already be a members-only update published with deeper analysis and the latest developments in one place. If you want that level of detail, join the membership and check it out. All right, final takeaway. The rule is simple. When governments make it harder to buy something, it's usually because that something is becoming important. When they track accumulation, it's usually because they're worried about loss of control. And when they implement restrictions quietly, it's usually because they don't want debate. So if you're watching this and you haven't taken silver seriously, maybe it's time to reconsider. Not because I'm telling you to, because the system itself is telling you to through its actions. Subscribe if you haven't, join the WhatsApp channel in the description for daily updates, and drop a comment below. Even just our John AG helps the algorithm push this content further. And here's my final question for you. If the gates are closing on private silver access in Europe, how long before they close elsewhere? And when they do, will you wish you moved sooner, or will you be glad you waited? Think about it, and I'll see you in the next one.